Are your children ready for real life? Welcome to episode number 6 in our series, How to Be Ready for Anything. Tonight, we're talking about figuring out vocation, gifts, real life skills, and the unique challenges of the 21st century. And we want to start with a question tonight, and we're asking you, please, to send in your questions. Next week, we wrap everything up with an entire hour, and we'll probably go a little bit long again, as we've been doing throughout this entire webinar, of answering your questions. And so we'll devote the entire time to that. You've sent in some phenomenal questions. We'll get to some of those tonight, but we want you to send us the questions that really are burning in your mind and on your heart and on your soul. So as we begin tonight with this question, what is your assessment of the home education movement? Let's commit this evening to the Lord in prayer. Father, we do ask you to give us wisdom on this. I want to thank you tonight for all the families who have done so much to make the sacrifices necessary to teach their children away from the system and outside the system, so that they could follow a more biblical pattern in the way that they think and the way they teach their children to think. And so we ask you tonight, Lord, to give us wisdom in the things that we all think about together and the way that we come to a unity of purpose and a unity of faith. We understand that without faith, it's impossible to please you in any of these things we do. We're not looking for a formula. We're looking for obedience. We're looking for wisdom from your word. And so help and guide us and direct us into those things tonight, we pray. In Jesus' name, amen. Now, one of the reasons we undertook this webinar is because of a nationwide fragility of the movement. And so I want to be very honest with you all this evening. It's one of the most significant movements of recent history that you parents are pulling your children out of the system. You've come to realize there's a problem and that there is a very legal and biblical way to pursue an alternative, and you've done that. But as we've looked at the system, and Victoria and I have been advocates of this system since the 1970s, and we've seen a weakness develop over the decades, and it concerns us a lot right now. And that weakness is the lack of a dominion pattern of thinking as Christians are meant to think. Our children are missing this dominion pattern of thinking. A paradigm of thinking is another way to put it. Many children are very confused about why their parents undertook the challenge of home education and why they made the sacrifices they did, why they're doing the things that they're doing. And the children don't see the biblical purpose or the urgent reasons, the vital reasons to take up the principled leadership required to keep this movement spreading across the nation and across the world. Some of them are even confused about marriage, whether they'll even get married or not, the importance of marriage, the importance of having children, and then what you do with those children. This is a problem not only in our state where we are now, but we've traveled the country, we've talked to parents, we've been processing many of the questions that have come in during this webinar. It's a problem all over the nation. And so let's illustrate one of the main weaknesses if we can, and I want to bring Victoria in here to talk to us about what drives the movement, honey.
Hello, this is Victoria. Well, I think that the big weakness with the homeschooling movement, really, we have to be honest and say that the weakness is that it's mommy-driven. And that might sound very odd coming from me because a homeschool mommy is certainly what I am, but I know that what homeschool mommies like me love most is to gather our chicks together and snuggle up together on the sofa with our cups of cocoa and just have a wonderful time reading together. And you know, this warm, cozy mothering style is very good, and it's very nurturing when the children are little, but we have to face it. As they get older, this is simply not a good formula for training up cultural leaders. So as our children grow up, the way we interact with them and the way we mothers discipline them has simply got to grow with them.
And so what we see as we watch the movement is that we notice that parents' teaching styles and techniques and priorities really are not growing with the children. We're keeping the children young. We're keeping the children undeveloped. And part of that is because mommies who are still driving the process, and because so many dads are not as engaged as they should be, mommies would like that warm, cuddly, secure, sheltered life to continue far into life as adults, as adulthood. And so too many young men, young boys are growing up being dwarfed or emasculated by the world and its real life issues. And so when we go out and we travel around the country, even go to places like Walmart, we see young men and young homeschooled men in public looking really overwhelmed, like they don't belong in this environment, they don't belong in this world, like they don't understand the world that they're in, and like they're, in many cases, very oblivious to the realities of life. And this really does concern me, because Christian men are not supposed to be this way. And so when I see these young men who are not mentally or morally aware, they're not alert, they don't seem to have any wary street smarts about them, I'm very concerned for the future. That's why we wanted to do this webinar. How do we help our young men, like the young boy in this picture, really understand the world that he lives in? And so what we've seen is a bottom line conclusion. This is, I think, the primary weakness in the movement. Homeschooled graduates, the so-called 17, 18, 19-year-olds, they're not the dominant minds in their environment. They are being dominated themselves by others, and they develop lives of docility and retreat and moral cowardice. That's what we're seeing. And so today's defeat of these young men, it takes two forms that we've noticed and we've observed. There are homeschooled adults right now, which are one of these two options. Either they're terrified of the world and they hide from it, usually staying at home and playing video games and doing other pursuits that are not productive and not dominion-oriented and not mission-oriented and not Christian-oriented. Or they're, number two, they're adults who desperately want to fit in with the world at any cost. And so let me draw your attention to the concept of Christian maturity and responsibility and obedience. It requires, and this is parents, what you need to be getting into your children early, age 6, 7, and 8. The concept requires the Christian to have the dominant mind of his generation for the purpose of care. It's not so that he can grow up and he can practice domination over people like the Islamic world teaches. Christians are different, but they have to be the leaders. They have to be the dominant thinking people of our time. Your children need to be the dominant minds of the 21st century. They need to know how to teach their children to be that for the purpose of care and direction and shepherding and discipleship. And this is the job Christians have in life, to be shepherds, to be disciple makers of others, and to know that they've got to be able to look at the world and know exactly what's going on, to know the lay of the land, that they need to understand the times so that they can take action. And so Christian education is about protecting. Here's a quote I want you all to get a hold of. Christian education is about protecting the bodies and the souls of your children from harm as you train them to be exposed to harm, and then to confront harm and to destroy harm. And so this is what we want you to come away with from this webinar. You are to be about Christian education, but you're training your children not to retreat into a little sheltered life or into an agrarian lifestyle or into a little place that's not involved in the big issues of life. You want them to be able to walk right into the world, to look it in the eye, to take it by the throat and say, here's how things are going to be different. So you're training your children, and you're protecting the bodies and souls of your children when they're really young, but you're training them to be exposed to harm that's out there. And yes, there is harm out there, but we don't need to be harmed by it. We need to be confronting the harm and destroying it. Look at this verse in Proverbs 28, verse 4. Those who forsake the law praise the wicked, but those who keep the law strive with them. And that's why we've made it such a big, important point in this webinar to direct you as parents to teach the law and theology to your children as primary. That's the primary thing that they need to learn academically and morally. They need to master it. This is what will give them the moral confidence and the moral purpose and the moral standing, the moral backbone, and even the moral authority they need to look the world in the eye and confront it and strive with people out there who want to bring chaos and disorder and harm to other people, to exploit other people. And so, where are we today? Well, we have a situation that needs to be fixed. Not only does the world need to be fixed, but we need to start right in our own homes with the homeschooling movement. Too many parents find that their children, when they reach 16, 17, 18, they have no social skill or capability of any kind, and so the parents tend to think, well, what do I do? I don't know what to do for my children. I didn't succeed in giving them these social skills. So I guess the only option is to send them off to a college campus experience. And parents, let me say, if your children do not have the equivalent of a college-level academic education or knowledge by age 18, then with all the opportunities they have to learn and with all the tools that are available to them, if they haven't been able to teach themselves, taking the foundation that you've given them to be able to read and research and study, well, then there's a deficiency of character in your children. And a college experience, if you throw them onto campus, that will only exploit them to their ruin. Now, here's a question that we have. Mr. Botkin, what do you do to make sure that your children do not crash and burn after they leave home, either spiritually by abandoning the faith, or character-wise, or by otherwise dropping the ball? How do they truly create intergenerational faithfulness without huge gaps in it? Okay. Let me start by answering it this way. Your children can actually crash and burn even in the home when they're at home with you, if they're not being guided to grow in wisdom and to confront the moral tests that face them every day by the things that they see around them. When you take them to church and the people that they're hanging out with, their little friends and colleagues and peers, they're being tested all the time. And they may be crashing and burning. If you're not watching carefully their spiritual condition, that can happen long before they leave home. And in many families it does, because the children are getting more of their theology from the popular culture and their peers than they are from their parents, and certainly more than they are from the church. And so I would say, well, how have we done it? Well, the greatest incubators of maturity we've found, Victoria and I have discovered, the incubators of responsibility and wisdom, are a family life that's very active, where we talk about sin all the time. We confront it. It's kind of a militant family life where we're engaged with our children. We want to know their minds and their souls and the condition of those minds and souls so that we can help them. And they're willing to talk to us about the things. You know, the songs that their peers try to share with them from their iPods and so forth that are totally accepted in the so-called evangelical Bible Belt community. And right now, by the way, just as a footnote, the huge, big popular thing is country music. That is a very destructive, counter-Christian theology. I mean, it's a genre of music that teaches theology in every song. Do your children know that? Do you know what they're listening to? Do you know how they're being affected by it? And so the incubators of maturity and wisdom in your children will be the kind of family life where you're talking about these things and where you have creative business ideas. We had a meeting this morning where we were talking about this webinar, and we got so sidetracked talking about a really fun, creative business idea. We just love talking about creative business. And then I would add an integrated church life. And if you can throw your children into the midst of this, a really involved family life, a creative business life, and an integrated church life between the ages of 7 and 17, you'll be giving them the kind of foundation they need to go out there and be leaders and not followers when they do leave home, when you do send them out with your blessing. And so while they're in this decade, this golden decade of opportunity and training, age 7 to 17, test them. Test them gradually as arrows. Give them opportunities outside the home, on the telephone, with their peers at church, where they're with you, and you can see how they're reacting to the big tests and pressures and temptations of the world. The pride of life. Test them as arrows before you shoot them out there, and make sure that there is always a community around them until they are mature enough to create those communities as real architects of civilization. That's what you're training them for, to be the leaders, the ones who create the culture, create the communities of civilization. And a quick warning about your little homeschool support group. So many parents think, okay, they're homeschool families just like we are. We can go to the basketball games or track meets or the football games or whatever it is, and we can just throw our children into those, trusting that they're going to be just fine and that they need that social interaction and so forth. We have seen so much destructive, peer-dependent compromise in these groups because the children are not quite ready for it, and they're compromised sometimes within a day or even 2 days of doing it. This can be a very destructive rather than supportive community when children are insecure and peer-dependent. And the destruction we've seen has lasted well into the 20s and 30s of some children. You all need to know about that. So now moving quickly into this huge question, the question of calling and vocation. What should I do with my life in the 21st century? And parents, what we tend to do, especially mommies, we tend to ask that question in this way. How are my children going to make a secure living? I want them to be really secure, really comfortable. What's the 21st century formula for getting the best job? How can they get enough validation from the elite oligarchy, which is, the little elite group that runs our country? And if you look closely at this question, this is how Christian parents have been asking this question about vocation and calling and security and jobs and money and making a living. We've been talking in these terms now for 4 and 5 generations. And this wasn't true at the beginning of the country. But you look at this. I mean, the first question is not, making a secure living by getting a job. Christians used to think in terms of mission. And we didn't used to think in terms of formula, the kind of formula that people follow, get on the school bus, get good grades, get a college degree, get a high-paying job, get a cool pension that just covers everything. And this was the alchemy of success, the American dream, and the formula for just creating money, which gives us our carnal security. And so we don't want our children to be thinking this way because it's not biblical. It's not the biblical solution. And let me suggest to you today, and this is kind of the advanced idea that we want you all to come away with from this webinar. The 21st century needs a completely new paradigm for education, and you all you've been pioneering this because you're homeschoolers. You figured out that putting your children on the school bus was a bad part of the formula, and you've rejected that. But keep going in this statement, comma. We need a new paradigm for worship, and we need a new paradigm for work, because the school model, the church model, and the career model are obsolete. They haven't worked. That's why there's so much confusion about going into the 21st century. The church has been endorsing this idea of the American dream since the 1950s, and people have really fallen for it. It's the pursuit of mammon at the expense of biblical obedience. So these models are obsolete because they were wrong, number one, biblically, but they haven't worked, have they? That's why our culture is so broken and people are so confused about what to do. The culture that they created in the 20th century simply cannot and must not be sustained. So here's the solution. Let's move our children and the entire culture to the biblical paradigm. We've lived too long in a humanistic paradigm, the paradigm of secular humanism. We need to just simply move back, not to some pragmatic paradigm with a new formula, but to the biblical paradigm. That's where we'll find answers and success and real security, spiritual security, not a kind of carnal security that causes us to depend so tightly on money. And this is what will determine between those who succeed and those who fail in the 21st century. This is what will separate the men from the boys. And it is a rather advanced civilization building concept, but you can take this. Now, let me just give you a real quick quote that I found from Life magazine in the 1950s. It said this from the secular magazine, looking forward way back in the mid-1950s. Quote, "The greatest challenge to Christianity today is a popular, bland, respectable faith termed secular humanism. It's often called the American way of life. It is not godless, but it keeps God in his place, the pulpit. It is the orthodoxy of the non-believer. It simply says, take up your credit card and follow me." And that's the end quote. That's the end of the quote. They could see what was happening in this booming economy of the 1950s, and to reverse all this confusion that we've inherited, that your parents inherited, that I've inherited, that your children are inheriting, we've got to cut right to the heart of the matter and teach the next generation the right concept on the doctrine of calling. And it can break you out of the dominant idea that all kids have to get on the school bus. And you have broken out of this. And if you've done that, you can break out of that the entire failed paradigm. So here's what we've taught our children and what we recommend that you teach your children about vocation. The first educational point on vocation is that there is only one calling, biblically. You are Christ's ambassador, and this is what we've told our children, the boys and the girls. You are Christ's ambassador. The biblical doctrine of calling is that there is only one occupation. Christ has said, you need to occupy until I come. But there are many business endeavors within that vocation, that calling, that one calling that there is. And that one calling must be the priority life mission of every Christian. So in short, calling is Christ. He's the caller, and we're the ones who are supposed to listen attentively. Calling is Christ enlisting his elect and commanding them in full-time wartime service. We don't live on a playground, we live on a battlefield. And this is one of the first lessons that we taught our children. That even though America will tell you this is the greatest playground in all of history, which it is, Christians need to see it as a battlefield. When we go out to Walmart, when we go out on the streets, we realize this is a massive spiritual battlefield, and we need to be alert, attentive. We need to have our minds turned on to see what we can do so we're not taken captive by it, but we're Christ's soldiers who can change it. The assignment is from Christ, the caller, is simple. Ensuring that Christ's civilization, which has been called in the past Christendom, is attained and preserved in every society. Jesus Christ is king by right. He's Christ the King. People are his subjects because we're living in his kingdom, and he has all authority in heaven and on earth. You all know this, and your children have heard this, but what does that actually mean? It means Christians have a great commission to be the king's local ambassador with global authority. So your children, as we talk to them about the Christian life, children, you're Christ's ambassador, and you have duties right here locally to announce the will of the king to the people. But as that ambassador, that very high-ranking position, you actually have global authority to do things globally, to pray globally, to act globally, but be about your business locally first. That's where you're really trained and tested. And so, parents, you need to help your children aspire to something far different than one career based on self-centered dreams to achieve carnal security by accumulating mammon. And this is what so many homeschoolers are about. The world is telling them this. Magazines, billboards, what they see on the internet, and even what their peers are doing. They're aspiring to have one career for life based on some self-centered dream that they have to achieve carnal security, which means, I'm just going to grab it with my own two fists and hang on to it. as much money as I can earn because I'm going to need that. We've got Obamacare now. How am I going to get good medical care if I don't have money to cover for me? So I'm going to accumulate mammon. This is how too many Christians are thinking in the churches. The church, because it too has become a broken model, has been endorsing this American dream, this way of thinking, this secular sacred distinction for so long. Your children are confused by it. You need to help your children break out of this. Let's keep going. Here's the second lesson on vocation that we've taught our children. If you obey Christ by seeking first his kingdom, and that's the command given to us in Matthew 6:33, seek ye first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, then all these things will be added to you. So do your children understand that and truly believe it? If you obey Christ by seeking first his kingdom, children, you will have both money and specific occupational guidance on what to do at every changing circumstance of your life and which business endeavors to undertake. When? At age 20, at age 30, at age 40, and you'll probably change 6, 7, 8 times in the 21st century. I think that the average, even in the last 2 decades, has been roughly 10 career changes on the part of the average American. I don't have those figures in front of me, but it's a lot. A lot of people have changed, often. So take a look at this quote. If you seek first his kingdom, you'll have the money you need for security. It's a promise. You'll have these things. And you'll have the guidance on what to do as Christ's ambassador, which does involve business. Here's the third lesson on vocation. Ambassadors have the greatest job in the universe. There's no other earthly position of higher prestige, higher rank, higher importance. And so your children, when they realize this and step into their duties and roles as ambassador, they get to teach others how to enjoy the 4 most fulfilling duties of civilization by living the fullest life there is. And these are the duties of civilization that every man is required to do, and that ambassadors are especially required to model. And so the ambassador doesn't just announce the will of the king. That's what every ambassador does. They go to a different nation, and to that other ruler, they announce the will of their king who sent them. And so we are ambassadors of the King of Kings and Lord of Lords, the one who's more sovereign, has a higher rank than any president in the world. And we are to announce Christ's will to him and to everybody else in the country. And so we don't just do that, though. The Christian ambassador shows everyone how to observe and keep the will of the king by obeying all of his commandments. That's the Great Commission. The obedient ambassador models obedience in each of the 4 great duties of civilization, all 4 of these. And this is how order is brought to the world, which is drowning right now in disorder. This is how we'll bring order to the 21st century. If we as ambassadors can see the biblical way to be a family man, a churchman, a businessman, and a citizen, or a statesman, this is how we will change the world. And your children need to see that these are the most enjoyable, fun, challenging, rich, memorable, significant activities created by a loving God for man. Right here. Some men just barely touch on one of them. Many of my peers at the end of the 20th century just said, hey, there's no way I can stay married. This is futile. The church is kaput. There's nothing I can do for the church. They don't want me anyway, except just to sit in the pew. The bad guys have taken over the local government. The only thing left for me is to be a dominion man, to take ground as a businessman. And I'm just going to do the best I can with business. And those men have gone through their entire lives missing out on the joys and the fulfillment that's available in the other 3 areas. So the 4th lesson on vocation is, as ambassadors teach these 4 duties, they get to enjoy themselves, all the benefits of each of these simultaneously. And your children need to know that. We can do all 4 simultaneously. We can actually do that. Your children can fulfill their duties to seek first the kingdom by achieving victory in all these 4 areas: success in family life, fruitfulness in church life, business profitability, local and national liberty and justice. You can help make sure that there is real justice and real liberty locally and nationally once we learn how to be good dads and good churchmen and good businessmen. We have so much wisdom by that time. There are things that we can offer as town fathers, and we can give recommendations. We can help lead the direction of the civil government. So let's talk a little bit about this question. I want to bring in my son Benjamin. So how on earth do I find time to be engaged in 4 different spheres?
Well, I think it should go without saying that not every goal and not every dream is worth having or fighting for. As a musician and a composer, I run into a lot of people today who think that every dream a person has, i.e., something they really want to do with their life, is valid and should be followed at all costs. But we know that, as Christians, we know that every thought needs to be taken captive to the obedience of Christ, and all things need to be conformed to the image of the Son. So that means that our bodies are not our own, nor our minds, nor our goals. Okay, well, let's say that you know what your duties and responsibilities are, and you have some good goals, so how do you achieve them? Well, as a young dad with 2 boys under 18 months, I go through a lot of transition and new things in my schedule, and often struggle to figure out how I can balance all the responsibilities and duties of a quadrivocational man. It is my goal to be a good family man, a good businessman, a good churchman, and a good statesman or citizen. But I'm a beginner at this, and I have questions like, how do I be a good provider for my family, be a businessman, and still have time to be with my family and train my family, be a family man, let alone spending time being involved in the church and the wider community? It often seems like there's just too much to juggle. And while it's true that there are very real limits to what you can do in certain seasons of life, I have been learning that there are a lot of things I can do to unclutter and streamline my life to free up time and mental processing power to focus on these things. Here is probably the one that has been most convicting and the hardest thing that I've learned, and that is, to be fruitful, I have to cut out everything of my life, schedule, and habits that is in the way of my goals. And if you take a look at this book, this is a book I read last year called The Disciplined Life by Richard Taylor. It's an excellent book, but I wanted to read a couple quotes from it. If life with us is to be fruitful and purposeful, we must heroically and decisively put the knife to most of the possible activities which could clutter every single day. And another quote, to become well-read is vastly more than reading. It is a matter of exclusion as well as inclusion. President Case of Boston University once said, if you want to become a specialist in New Testament literature, you must say goodbye to the comics forever. And to a lot of other reading too. Whatever one's goal may be, it can only be achieved by the sacrifice of the lesser. And I wanted to share a verse that's in line with this. Proverbs 12, verse 11, he who tills his land will have plenty of bread, but he who pursues worthless things lacks sense. And I think this means more than simply cutting out worthless activities, but we also need to be recalibrating our hearts and minds to cut out the affections that lead us to desire participation in these worthless activities. Because the reality is this, we will do what we really want to do inside. For something to become a priority in your schedule, it needs to be a priority in your heart. You won't wake up at 5 a.m. and exercise if you don't really believe that it is more important than sleeping in. You won't spend Sunday afternoons invested in your family or in the church if your mind is on the big game, whether you are watching it or not. So this comes full circle again, all back to the heart. And I just wanted to read this verse, Proverbs 4:23, that we're all familiar with. Watch over your heart with all diligence, for from it flow the springs of life. And it also determines what your goals will be and how you will reach them.
On the question of diligence, a lot of people have asked, what are the most important skills to be developing? What are the important businesses? What are the jobs? What are the things that are going to be the most stable or the most profitable? And I think that there's a lot of room for flexibility, because if you master this concept of being disciplined and using your time well, there's really nothing that you can't do, especially for homeschoolers that have taught themselves how to learn, how to teach themselves new things, and how to pick up new skills on the way. So one of the things that our dad has taught us is that one way to find out what you should be doing is to figure out what is it that only you can be doing. There's probably 10 to 15,000 things that you could be doing for work in your town, but what are the things that only you could be doing? You know, what are the things that areas that you're not going to have a lot of competition in might be worth pursuing? But on the other hand, you can also look at areas where there's lots of competition and therefore a very large market, and those might be areas that would be very fruitful, and you'd be a good steward to look into those. You should look into the things that have the greatest growth potential and be wise according to the times to figure out what the needs are going to be that you're going to be addressing. And I think that in doing all of these things, you should also have an attitude of, in addition to maintaining discipline, also maintaining flexibility and being open to the options that will give you the flexibility and your children the flexibility to learn the things that they need to learn and to pursue the important projects that they really are going to need to be a part of in the future, and figure out ways to make your career fit around your vocation and the job that you have, or the 4 jobs that you have in being an ambassador of Christ.
Right, but keep in mind, we are not advocating careers. I mean, that's part of the broken paradigm. The lifelong career can so keep you away from doing what you really need to be doing. Your main priority jobs in life are these 4 that you do simultaneously with one another. Family life, you need to be a family man. You need to be a businessman. You need to be a churchman. And you need to be a statesman or a citizen. And so your children, parents, need to be the leaders in the 21st century. And to do that, they need to develop entrepreneurial leadership. They need to be creating businesses, not, trying to find the kind of lifelong employment in a career that would just lock them into that. How are they going to lead if that's where they end up? They need to be creating the businesses that employ and train and bless people, the people who are being exploited, who are being dominated by a materialistic culture. And business is such a wonderful place to be able to disciple people. And this is why you need to be training your children to see that you don't just set one of these aside, one of these 4 things aside so you can pursue the others, or set everything aside so that you can just pursue one. You must balance everything you're doing and choosing the things that, as Isaac said, that only you can do from time to time, and make sure that it integrates all these things together. And you can do it. Now, in different seasons of life, and especially, for example, with my son Ben, who has 2 young sons of his own, he's focused a whole lot more right now on family life and business profitability than he is church life. Now, he's an active leader in the church, and he's not neglecting that, but he has a little bit higher emphasis on the other things. What he's doing in the local community as a community leader is farther down on his list of priorities, but he has not neglected that to the exclusion of the others. Now, here's a question that's come in. Should I strive to find my children's gifts and push them to pursue those with excellence? For example, my oldest shows a gift for playing piano by ear. Should I find her the best lessons and push her to be a great pianist? Now, Ben, you might want to say something on this, so I want you to be ready on this one. But here's my real short advice on gifts. Don't focus on the gifts. Parents, don't look for things like these. Seeing the needs and in filling them, the most powerful gifts will be given spiritually and supernaturally. So what I want to admonish you all to do is to develop the gift of being able to see needs and opportunities. This only comes by learning to think less about yourselves and more about others. So don't base a direction in life on a gift that you think you have at age 15 or at age 16. Your duty is to be a family man, a businessman, a churchman, and a statesman. You need to be about those businesses. And when you begin to see needs, and this is how you'll create your businesses, you'll see a need. You'll see a need that needs to be filled. You'll see a service that needs to be performed. Those, anyway, are always the most successful businesses in any economy. And right now, for example, there's so many different stages of economy all around the world. In South Sudan, for example, they have nothing. Every single thing that needs to be done has to be done, from road building to digging ditches, to put the sewers in, to get the running water to run in through pipes as plumbing. They don't even have any of those things. They don't have electricity. They don't have any power. And so there's so many different kinds of needs to be fulfilled. A South Sudanese person would begin there by looking at those needs, not thinking about his gifts, and then fulfilling those. And it's the same in a developed country like the United States. Don't be thinking and focusing about yourself and your gifts. And I've seen so many men, when they start looking for the needs and trying to meet them as a leader, there truly will be real supernatural gifts developed in them, because that really is what a gift is, isn't it? It comes from God supernaturally. And so that's what you want to see happen. Ben, anything you'd like to add just on the music story?
Well, yeah, I did have a couple of thoughts on the issue of gifts, and something I've thought a lot about, and that is, well, how do you say, okay, I've got gifts, or my son has got gifts, but how do you really know what your gifts are? And I wondered that because thinking back in my life, there have been a number of different things that I have enjoyed doing or have been interested in doing, even before I got to music. When I was little, I really liked to draw. That was something that I enjoyed. Now, did that mean, and I could have at that point thought, oh, I have the gift of drawing, the gift of art, I need to do this to the exclusion of other things. But when I was little, I also really liked to shoot hoops, just in the backyard by myself. And I could have thought, oh, well, I like this. This is my gift. This is my calling. And later on, I really enjoyed playing chess. And I could have thought, oh, well, I'm good at chess. Well, sort of. I like playing chess. This must be my gift. This must be my calling, which I should follow to the exclusion of the other things. And then a few years later, I get interested in music, and I could think the exact same thing about music. But I guess the point that I wanted to share is that when it comes to identifying what true gifts and skills you actually have, it's usually in the context of trying to identify and meet needs that true gifts are usually discovered. And it's more than just, oh, I'm kind of interested in this thing. Because you're going to be interested, if you're not a totally dry person, you're going to be interested in hundreds and thousands of different things in your life. You're going to be interested in botany, you're going to be interested in art, you're going to be interested in business. And you have so many opportunities to pursue different things. But it's really in the context of trying to identify needs and meet them that you realize, oh, you know what? Here's something I can actually do really well by God's grace.
Yeah, it's very important that in talking about our gifts, we aren't confused by the things that we enjoy doing. And this is something that the world does to a very large extent. When you go talk to career counselors or get advice on what you should be doing, they always start by asking what you enjoy doing. And there's some value in knowing the things that you are good at. This is extremely important, but knowing the weaknesses of the world around you or the needs of the people around you is a lot more important. And even just knowing the situation, the circumstances that you're in now, or the circumstances that you're going to be in the future. Paul Johnson is the historian that we've quoted several times and recommended several of his books in probably every session of this webinar. And his father was an artist, and Paul Johnson wanted to be an artist. And his father took him aside and said, "Son, that's really not a very good idea. The art world of the 20th century is going to be run by losers like Picasso. You really don't want to be a part of that. There's really not going to be a place for dedicated, serious artists for the next 50 years. So you need to pick a different job. You need to pick a different vocation. And so even though Paul Johnson may have been a very gifted artist and known a lot about art and been in a very good position to pursue that, it has been so much more beneficial for the world that instead of being, a third-rate painter pushed out of the way by modern chaotic deconstructionists in London, he's become a historian and has been able to teach and comment on the world in a way that, in many ways, apparently, only he can. He has some of the better observations about history than other historians. So be very aware of the weaknesses and the needs, both in the people around you, but also in the world that you're going to be living in. And remember that as Christians, we exist to serve God, and we exist to serve others. And we need to be looking for the ways that we can most effectively serve others in deferring to them and honoring them, carrying their burdens, and extending the Great Commission so that they can know God's truth. And so while it is very important to know the strengths that you have so you can try to identify those things that only you can do, it's the needs that are around you that really need to be driving those types of decisions that you'll be making.
And keep the correct new 21st century paradigm in mind. For the 20th century, people grew up thinking about just becoming part of this statist security state, a workforce state. And it was really a slave economy, very similar to what was advocated by Plato and all his writings. And an oligarchy is in charge, and everybody else just kind of fits in as servants and slaves based on abilities, gifts, and talents. You don't want your children to even be thinking that way. Now, as Isaac mentioned, you still can go to a so-called career counselor, and they'll say, "What are you good at?" Well, they're helping to sort people into little cubbyholes as servants, not as leaders, as those who serve the planned economy, not those who create it and do something totally different. That's why we don't want you to be caught up in thinking about, well, what are my children good at, so that they can take their little place in the pyramid, in the ant colony. We want them to be the leaders of tomorrow who create the entire new business climates all over the world that are so different. A decentralized state system, a decentralized economy, where there's so many more independent businesses and business people working everywhere, learning outside the brick and mortar college, learning and working outside of the big corporations, driving the economy through independence. So let's talk now for a minute about entrepreneurship versus wage slavery. Here's a question from a dad. I work at a job and I'm so beat when I get home. I don't know how to have energy. I don't have energy or the heart to teach my kids anything, especially about starting businesses and changing the world. So what do I do? And it's hard to know even where to start on this, except to say, do you see the broken nature of the system that we've inherited? I mean, it should not be this way, that this poor dad is stuck in a job that so exhausts him and keeps him locked into the materialistic culture that he's been a part of, that he's paralyzed. I mean, literally, his energy is sapped. He doesn't have the strength. It's even hard for him to see the vision of how he teaches his children anything different. And every day they're seeing this very same thing. Dad gets up early, he goes off to work, long commute, works hard, wears himself out, comes home. He's trying to make some other guy successful who are his superiors at work, and he's not getting very far ahead. So what do I do? Okay. In terms of fruitfulness, multiplication, and increase, we have to be thinking differently. Now, I'd like to, if I can, bring my... Okay, this is... Benjamin has a few things to say about this.
Just a reminder, really, and that is, it's really important. It's really amazing to me when I just read the scripture and how it teaches that basically the nature of Christianity is one of multiplying and increasing and growing, and productivity. And I think that regardless of what spheres we end up being involved in, we need to think more like producers than like consumers. And we have talked about this earlier on in this series. But this theme is all throughout Scripture. Genesis 1:28 says, "Be fruitful and multiply." John 15 verse 8 says, "Bear much fruit, and so prove to be my disciples." Matthew 13 talks about some bore 100-fold, some 60, and some 30. The verses about sowing and reaping more than you sowed. The verses that talk about in all labor there is profit. Matthew 25 talks about the good and faithful servant, that he multiplied his resources. And so I say all this to make the point that if our heart and our desire should really be to bear a lot of good fruit and consume a little bit, take a little bit, and from that little bit, produce a lot for the Lord, a lot, to multiply and increase resources, opportunities, disciples, and all the good things of life. And I think if that's our mindset and that's our attitude, then we won't be mindless wage slaves or mindless consumers, even if we do end up working for other men.
So here's a question about, there have been several of these actually, questions on internships and apprentices, online training. There's lots of different ways to learn skills. We've talked a lot about the fact that one of the strengths that homeschoolers have is their ability to learn how to teach themselves things and to be self-taught, to be autodidacts. But there are a lot of things that are difficult to teach yourself, and there are a lot of things that you can learn a lot faster with instruction. Now, technical knowledge is very easy to learn. Mentorship is something that's far more useful for learning principles, for being guided in your character, for mastering discipline, for gaining understanding, learning how to build connections. And there are definitely harder skills that instruction and coaching is extremely helpful for. But any knowledge that you can learn yourself, you should be learning for yourself. It's not a good idea for you to be wasting a mentor's time by showing up to learn business skills and then not even know how to respond to emails or use Word or Excel or have thought even about basic math. So continue to be building, as young men, continue to be building the skills that you think will come in handy, even if you have an opportunity to be mentored in a trade. And if you have that opportunity, make sure that you honor your mentor and honor his time really well. And for parents, this is something that you need to start teaching your children while they're very young. Sons should be learning a trade by the time they're 13 or 14. And that's something that you can be doing or finding opportunities for them to learn from someone else. Here's a really good quote. It's an old proverb that says, "He who does not teach his son the law and a trade teaches him to be a fool and a thief." And today, the world is full of people that haven't learned trades and are collecting unemployment or in other ways, eating out the substance of the productive people in society, the productive people in the country, simply because they haven't taken the time to develop discipline or skills or be part of actually contributing and meeting the needs of the people that are around them.
Very quickly on graduation, we get a lot of questions about this. My question about homeschooling is, how do you know when they know enough to graduate? Well, okay. Basic answer, when they're able to lead their generation with moral confidence and cultural discipleship, then you've given them a good education. And let me just refer you back to sessions number 1 and 2, which contain lists of the priority content that we wanted to give our children. Now, are our children really able to lead their generation with moral confidence and cultural discipleship? Well, they've scratched the surface on that. And so they truly haven't, they really haven't, graduated. I mean, we're still working with them on this because there's so much. I'm still working with myself on this. I want to be able to lead my generation with moral confidence and clarity, with moral authority, and with cultural discipleship. And I've got a long way to go on that. So that's one reason in the Botkin family we don't do so-called graduations. Yeah, there's a lot that we systematically want to teach them when they're young, like age 13. Yes, we've got our sons learning skills that will be useful for them in trades, but we don't do that. People ask us, well, did your children get credentials and college degrees? No, they haven't. They don't even have a kindergarten degree. But that hasn't stopped them from doing wonderful things, or even getting, for example, job offers to be professors at college. And my oldest son, Isaac, was getting those when he was 19 or 20, I believe, and he turned them down and remind them that, look, I don't have any credentials. I don't even have a high school diploma. They said, that doesn't matter. We would like you on the faculty at our college to teach, certain things that he was very good at. It was because he had learned a trade at 13. He had perfected it. By the time he was 20, he was, he'd invested a good 7 years in that. Question, how did the Botkin family do graduation? Well, we're still working on teaching and training our children for the future. Now, let me just point out, for any assessment test you want to give your children, if it had to be reduced to just one question, this is the one that we would tend to give. There's so much wrapped up into this. And dads, this could be a pretty good one for any suitors who come calling on your daughters. What is the kingdom of Jesus Christ, and how will you spend your life seeking it? This goes back to the promise in Matthew 6:33, seek first the kingdom of God. That's the first thing. Do our children even know what the kingdom of God is and what it means to seek it? Well, that in very short terms, it means to extend the reign of Jesus Christ. That's how you seek, the victory of his kingdom. And accreditation, very quickly now, a question. Do I need a degree just in case the state tells me I can't homeschool my children without it? We could spend an hour on this. I would begin to answer by saying, well, what kind of degree? What if they tell you need a PhD in education or a master's from a teacher's college? Would you bow the knee to the state just to get that so you could homeschool your children? Or would you give up and throw your children back into the government system? Christians have to stop complying with unlawful laws, especially without challenging the idea behind that law before they're ever passed. We should be articulating and declaring our independence as parents to have the freedom to educate our children, because this freedom comes to us as a command from God Almighty. The state does not regulate this. And so just to help you in your thinking, no, we don't have to go chasing these degrees just because we're afraid something's going to happen. What would you do if they passed a law outlawing spanking? Would you just simply stop spanking your children? You can't do that. You have to continue to obey God first more than man. You have to obey God first. Question. Did you make your children get degrees? No. Isaac, can you add anything to this, please?
Yes. A long time ago, in the early days of America, there were actually universities prior to there being schools. So the idea of getting a university education actually is older than the idea of having a public school education or even a private school non-home education. And there were times when you would need to seek out a pretty high-level vocation by finding a high-level teacher to learn a skill. And even at this time, there really weren't the concept of degrees. Well, today things are extremely different in that there's lots of ways to learn different skills. There's all kinds of vocations that are out there. The future jobs that are going to be in the growth industries are the ones that are going to be the least restricted regarding careers and regarding credentials and diplomas. The new technologies that are driving the economy right now are inventing new jobs for people to do faster than schools can come up with diplomas that describe those jobs. In the last session, we talked about the mobile internet and mobile devices and mobile applications market as being the fastest growing, in terms of money, the fastest growing industry. And this is an industry that just didn't exist 5 or 6 years ago. So theoretically, that industry should still be waiting on the diplomas that you would need in order to get into that industry. Ideally, if we believed in the statistic going around that 40% of all new careers are going to require new diplomas, if that were true, then we'd only have developers for the mobile internet. They'd only have been around for a year or so because they would have spent the last 4 years getting their diplomas to actually work in this field. So this idea that we're going to need more and more degrees to maintain a proper ordering of the industry that's filling with these newer and newer jobs that keep popping up every year is just very silly. There isn't time for such a rapidly growing industry to really rely on degrees and certifications. Now, it's true that in mobile internet development, there may be guys who are the ones installing the cell phone towers that are working with thousands of volts of electricity that need to do some paperwork to make sure that they are in compliance with safety regulations. That sort of thing might make a lot more sense than saying that you have to get a college degree and a Microsoft certification before you can put together an app that goes on the Microsoft store, or a Google certification before you can write code for Android, or Apple putting together a college and making you get diplomas before you can put things on the iPhone store. At the end of the day, any time that the free market is driving an industry very quickly to take advantages of new technology, the diplomas are going to be 10 years late. And the guys that teach the classes for those diplomas are probably going to be 15 years late, using equipment that's 10 years late, and they won't have had a lot of experience in the real world anyway. So even their 15-year-old information is probably less useful. So in all of the things that are really financially viable at this point, that look like growth industries, it's the guys that don't have the degrees that are making the most headway. And most of the people that have built the giant technology companies like Apple and like Microsoft are college dropouts themselves. They were studying one field and decided they would be better off pursuing a career, or rather starting businesses and beginning new jobs in an area where there wasn't instruction that they could even be pursuing at that time. So don't be afraid that you need validation, that you need credentials to be working in some of these areas. And in a lot of fields, credentials will actually hurt you. I worked at an animation studio and was involved in vetting some of the new animators that we were going to be hiring, and we would go through their demo reels, and if it was a bad demo reel, we'd throw it away. And if it was a good demo reel, we would call them. But if it was kind of a middle-of-the-road demo reel, nothing amazing, we would check their CV, and we would see if they'd been to an animation school. And if they'd created a so-so animation reel with the help of a professor, they weren't worth our time. But if they'd managed to do that on their own, we would almost give them a call. So sometimes the lack of a diploma is actually going to be something that will help you get your foot in the door when it comes to showing that you have dedication, the ability to teach yourself a skill, and that you're going to be an asset working on a project, even if you haven't spent 4 years in some kind of playpen that's supposedly teaching you how to do things in the real world.
Yes, thank you, Isaac. You know, it's interesting. I haven't told the children all the stories of my life, and I'm trying to be better about doing this. But my entire life, my entire career, the career that I had in Washington, D.C. as a political advisor and consultant, no one ever asked me, in my career in media, no one ever asked me what degrees I had. It was just not an issue. In a productive world where people are being productive and created, and they've made themselves necessary to that part of the world, people don't care about degrees. I mean, literally no one ever asked me. No think tank that I ever did work for. The Reagan administration, the first Bush administration. Nobody ever asked me what they wanted what I could give them. They didn't care about that. And so, moving forward, well, here's an interesting quote by George Gilder, quoted by Gary North. If there's a kiss of death for entrepreneurship, it is the outlook of the liberal arts departments of an American university. He concludes it's better to get on-the-job training in a mid-sized business noted for its entrepreneurship than it is to earn an MBA. And by the way, at an economics conference recently, one of the most successful daddies out there with his family, who's built $1 million business, was asked, well, what's the biggest mistake he made? He said it was getting an MBA because of what he learned there. It was an outlook that was really dangerous and bad. Gilder goes on to say, it's better to come under the influence of a manager who has prospered in a growing company than a professor of business administration. Okay, now we've got to move quickly into military service. David Botkin.
We get a lot of people that ask us what our opinion is of military service, joining the military. And in talking with them, we found that there have been about 4 main reasons that they're interested in joining. Number one, they want to join the military in order to ultimately get a degree when they're done. As we've already talked about, this is not necessarily a good thing to get even through other means. The next objective they often have is as a career, a long-term career in the military. Well, when you join the military, you take an oath to uphold and defend the Constitution. And the Constitution does not allow for a long-term military standing army. Further, the Founding Fathers did not want this sort of military. They were very, very afraid of permanent standing armies. James Madison said, a standing military force with an overgrown executive will not long be safe companions to liberty. So there is an opportunity to do some limited stuff in a military career. There's some careers that might be viable and lawful, but this shouldn't be the normal thing for lots and lots of people to be able to do. The third objective that a lot of people have when they're looking to join, and this is a wonderful objective, is to protect and serve their country. But we need to ask ourselves, what's the purpose ultimately of armed defense? And that's to protect the lives and the freedoms and the property of the people that live in our country. And the problem is, it's hard to put this delicately, but right now the greatest danger to the American people, to their lives and their freedoms and their property, is not foreign threats. It's actually the government in Washington, D.C. It's the IRS, it's the EPA, it's all these different entities that have been created that are unconstitutional. And then finally, a lot of people, they know about these sorts of problems, and they know about some of the other problems that I'll mention in just a moment. And so their goal is to join in order to have some sort of positive reforming effect on the U.S. military. But I think that this last goal, while very noble, is, I think, very misplaced. I remember reading the autobiography of Major General Singlaub, and he talked about, towards the end of his book, his military career. He was becoming increasingly at odds with the political administration and the direction the military was taking, and was not pleased with it. And ultimately he came to the conclusion, as a major general, that he could have more effect on the direction that the military was going if he were to retire than stay in. And this was after 30 years of honorable service, in which he'd risen from basically a private all the way to a major general. So I don't know what effect a private who's basically just a small cog in a very large machine would really effectively have. Further, most people that are thinking this way, they think that they can go in and change things. They don't even know what needs to be changed. They haven't studied the U.S. military extensively. They aren't familiar with all the problems, and so they really, I think that they would very rapidly be just amalgamated into this machine, and their will would be subsumed to the will of the men that have created the military bureaucracy that we have right now. So here's some problems that people need to consider as they consider military service. Number one, most of America's military actions have been unbiblical and unconstitutional over the last 40, 50, 60 years. Further, we now have women in the military. This is an abomination. according to Scripture. There's rapidly declining moral standards within the military. Like, for example, fornication in a war zone or overseas was forbidden. It was illegal for many, many years until just a couple years ago when that law was repealed. We've also just recently had sodomites are now allowed to openly serve in the military. We've also seen a lot of the ways that we fight wars, we end up pragmatically supporting the wrong side. And then further, the long term, we see that we engage in a lot of unbiblical nation building, sort of a regime establishing or stabilizing operations that are not the business of the government. If it's not the business of the government to build infrastructure at home, businesses and things like that, then it's certainly not the business of the U.S. government to do it overseas in Iraq or Afghanistan. So that's my very short summary why I don't think it's helpful for people to join. I think it's in most cases a bad choice. The last word, though, is if there is someone considering joining, ultimately they have to recognize that all of their actions have to be bound by the law of God and the U.S. Constitution if they are to serve in the U.S. military. And so if they join, they must be ready to disobey any unlawful orders that they are given. And this will result in a court-martial, which will almost assuredly result in a dishonorable discharge, which basically makes them a felon for the rest of their lives. So this is a very dangerous thing to consider when you realize that there's so many things that the U.S. government is doing that are illegal in one way or another and would have to be disobeyed.
Okay, the question, should we be preparing our sons for an economic and social collapse? Well, okay, great question. That's a good parenting question. But I better just start by saying, hey, America has been in an economic and social collapse now for 2 generations. And this is by direct intervention in the will of God. And it's part of a chastisement of God that's promised in Deuteronomy 28 and Leviticus 26. And so, yes, you should be preparing them to live in this time of economic and social collapse. So we have lost so much social fabric and the value of the dollar and the freedom to even conduct business. They need to be fully aware of these things and the direction. They need to know that the direction for the future, yes, it's very, very fragile. Now, the good news is that things are so bad now that there could be such a collapse that it's time, great opportunity to begin rebuilding when things stumble and fall clear to the ground. And this has happened in so many different times in history. You can look at history and you can see the trends and you can see when things actually collapse and totally fail. What a phenomenal opportunity that is for Christians who have wisdom and knowledge to rise up and take the lead and begin the rebuilding process and lay the foundations together again.
Yes, our dad did teach us a lot about how to prepare for living in uncertain, fragile times, preparing for some sort of collapse, as you might say. And he did this by teaching us about crime. And he taught us about the hearts of men and how bad men will go from bad to worse as their consciences become more and more seared. And the result is they will become more and more brutal and cruel in the crimes that they commit. And so the counter to that is not hopelessness, but we need to work to increase civility in our society. We need to recognize that as a result of the decline of some men, women and children are at greater risk than they should be. And so as men, we have duties to protect and defend the innocent. And this isn't easy, and this takes a lot of work. And the problem is that a lot of men over the last several hundred years have been more interested in entertainment and pursuing their own interests than in working hard to protect the innocent. I was reading a sermon today, and in it the author was lamenting that young men were more interested in playing games and dicing, and they had instead taken up whoring in towns instead of shooting in the fields. Well, that man was Hugh Latimer, and he was preaching to Edward VI, who was the king at that time, and he was talking about the importance of young men being trained in arms. And he said, "My poor father was as diligent to teach me to shoot as to learn anything. So I think other men did their children. In the reverence of God let it be continued. Let a proclamation go forth charging the justices of the peace that they see such acts and statutes kept as were made for this purpose. And he's referring there in the end to laws that were on the books that made it a requirement that men train their children in the use of the bow and the arrow. And by law, his father had taught him. Starting at age 7, I believe it was, men had to supply their children with bows and arrows until I think it was about age 15. This was the law. It had been on the books for hundreds of years at this point. This is the same man that was ultimately martyred and said, "Play the man, Master Ridley. We shall this day light such a candle by God's grace in England as I trust shall never be put out." I think there was some connection between the way his father had trained him from a young age and ultimately the way he was able to end his life. Now, if we go to the next slide here, we see a graph. Now, this is the crime rate in America, and it shows a little over the last 100 years, starting in about 1900. You can see there in the 1930s where Prohibition ended and the crime rate went back down, and then starting in the 60s, how it just skyrocketed back up. This is the murder rate, which is a pretty decent metric for summarizing some violent crime, or most violent crime. And then you can see there towards the late 90s, you can see it drop again. Now, what happened was Americans saw the climbing crime rate, and they started clamoring for the ability to carry weapons. In the late 80s, it was very hard to carry weapons in most states. Most states wouldn't even grant carry permits. But then they slowly started to. So by 1993, there was a study conducted by a man named Gary Kleck called the National Self-Defense Survey. And his survey, which has been there have been liberals that have tried to attack it, but even the most fervent anti-gun liberals have admitted that Kleck's methodology is impeccable. There's really nothing that they can say. They hate his conclusion, but they can't really attack it very effectively. He concluded as a result of his study that privately owned guns at that time were being used to stop roughly 2.5 million crimes per year in the United States of America. Since then, you can see the crime rate continued to drop. Also, since then, the number of guns that were available in America have just exploded. Since '98, roughly 170 million guns have been sold in the United States of America, and about 70 or 80 million of those just since Obama has been elected. There's also, as a result of the explosion in the availability of carry permits, there's now about 9 or 10 million people in America that actually have those carry permits, about 3% of the population across the whole nation. Now, if you listen to the media, it sounds like gun owners are this little tiny radical fringe that are just way in the background of American culture. And I think a lot of Americans and homeschoolers are terrified of being added to some new government list, and they don't want to become one of these demonized gun owners. But they really shouldn't be afraid to buy guns and teach their children to use them. They should be like Hugh Latimer, who recognized, this is what my father did, this is important. I think Americans should pay more attention to people like George Washington on this issue than the media. Here's what George Washington had to say about firearms. He said, "Firearms stand next in importance to the Constitution itself. They are the American people's liberty teeth and keystone under independence. From the hour the Pilgrims landed to the present day, events, occurrences, and tendencies prove that to ensure peace, security, and happiness, the rifle and pistol are equally indispensable. The very atmosphere of firearms everywhere restrains evil interference. They deserve a place of honor with all that is good." And when we talk about the realities of crime and men becoming wicked, it's well to remember these sorts of things. And history, a study of history, reveals that nations rise and nations fall, fiat currencies the same, and we're not able to control this. But as men, what we can do is we do what God has given us to do. We obey His commands, we take necessary steps for the protection of our families, and then we trust God for the rest. And this is what good men do.
Now, we've had a couple of questions about what are some of the things that Dad has done to prepare us for uncertain times. And the answer is it's basically the same thing, that these are the same lessons and the same goals and the same skills that Dad would have taught us if we were in very certain times. We've talked about the importance of being flexible and the importance of looking for needs to meet and ways to serve and ways to extend the kingdom. And so people who are flexible will always be able to find opportunities to do that, whether the world that they live in is stable or whether the world that they live in is very unstable. And entrepreneurs have always known this. They've always known that decentralization is good because it makes you more flexible. And there's a lot of industries that through new technology or new trends are being decentralized here in the United States. In fact, the firearm industry is one of them. All of those new gun sales that are happening in the United States in the last 15 years are all going through American companies which are fairly small. Most of them are very small, family-owned gun manufacturers with very small machine shops. And we have a fairly large manufacturing industry that has kind of grown up around this one need, this one market, but it's a very decentralized manufacturing industry. We're seeing that happen with local production of other products. We're seeing that happen with local food production. And this kind of decentralization is really good if the economy is strong, and it's actually even better if the economy is weak. And it helps maintain the economy if the big systems, the larger supply chains get disrupted. It's these smaller decentralized ones that will actually do well. And entrepreneurs have always known that peace is good for business and war is good for business. But it's really important to remember that we're not just talking about business. We're not just talking about finding a career or making your job define what it is that you want to accomplish with your life. We're talking about raising families. We're talking about cultural reformation. We're talking about extending God's kingdom. And we're talking about developing the church. And the Bible teaches us, and history shows us, that peace is good for the church and that persecution is good for the church. Kevin Swanson has a great quote. He says we should pray for strength and for tests and for strength during tests because you don't want to waste a perfectly good trial. It would just be a waste if you didn't manage to deal with a trial well. It would just be a total waste of a good trial. So it's important that we remember that stability is a great time to preach the gospel and instability is a great time to preach the gospel. We have to be able to do that in season and out. And remember that God commands us not to be anxious because He's sovereign. And we need to trust in His will, but we also need to make sure that we're not doing that in just a fatalistic way, where God knows what's best and we just have to live with it. That's not the point. The point is that we need to be confident that God will place us in the times and the situations that He wants us to be in, and that He wants us to work in, where He wants us to be serving Him and to be fulfilling the Great Commission. Romans 8:28 is a verse that we all know. It says, "And we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good, for those who are called according to His purpose." And this isn't a verse that means that your life is going to be easy. But what it does mean is that God will give you opportunities to fulfill His good purpose, and that we're here on earth to do His work. And that includes the building of His church and the extending of His kingdom. And that's something that we are going to be able to do regardless of what happens if we follow Him.
Thank you, Isaac. Our family is so encouraged about the future. And yeah, things are very rough, and there are many things that we can't see clearly. But I want to draw your attention to one of the most phenomenal quotes by a mother to her 13-year-old son. They were standing on a hill overlooking the town of Boston and watching fighting going on. And she had the vision to say this to her son, John Quincy. These are times in which a genius would wish to live, because what she could see happening was that there's being a shakeup, and there's such a shakeup just on the verge of happening here in the United States. The centralized statist government is losing its grip on control and on the tyrannical oppression of a free people. Abigail goes on to say, "It is not in the still calm of life or the repose of a Pacific station," that means a peaceful station, "that great characters are formed. The great internal moral character in a man is formed. The habits of a vigorous mind are formed in contending with difficulties. All history will convince you of this, and that wisdom and penetration are the fruit of experience, not the lessons of retirement and leisure. Great necessities call out great virtues. And parents and children who are listening, I mean, there are such great necessities right now. It's in the beginning of the 21st century. Abigail goes on to say, when a mind is raised and animated by scenes that engage the heart, when those qualities, which would otherwise lie dormant, wake into life and form the character of the hero and the statesman, war, tyranny, and desolation are the scourges of the Almighty, and ought no doubt to be deprecated. Yet it is your lot, my son, to be an eyewitness of these calamities in your own native land, and at the same time to owe your existence among a people who have made a glorious defense of their invaded liberties, and who, aided by a generous and powerful ally, with the blessing of heaven, will transmit this inheritance to ages yet unborn. And so here's a mother telling her son, looking at one of the most scary moments of history, she is seeing the whole scope of providence. She's seeing that, yes, wars and calamities like this are from the hand of God. She's teaching him doctrine. She's teaching him theology. She's teaching him about history. She's teaching him about the future. And so this is our lot. And I would say this to all you children too. What a phenomenal time to be alive. People would so want to be alive. I am so thankful that we're facing the very uncertainties we are. And I close out this series with a quote from Jesus Christ himself, John 14:21, who said, "He who has my commandments and keeps them is the one who loves me." And so parents, for you who want your children to be known as those who love Christ, they love their Savior. I mean, this is how he defines it. He who has my commandments and keeps them is the one who loves me. This is why, and this summarizes our whole webinar so well, you must be teaching them the law and the commandments of Christ. You must be. Your children need to know them, and they need to have them, and they need to keep them, and they need to teach others about them. And then the Lord goes on to say, "And he who loves me will be loved by my Father, and I will love him and will disclose myself to him." And so the success of your children in an uncertain age, in a very rocky 21st century, will depend on your children being able to know the will of God. They're commanded to pray, "Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth." Thy will be done on earth. And they're here to work with Jesus Christ to do it. How will they choose exactly who to marry, what to be doing while they're businessmen, while they're statesmen? Well, if they're keeping these commandments, Jesus Christ himself will disclose himself to them and give them and show them the way. Show them how to make these decisions. Show them what needs to be done. Give them a vision for what kind of society and culture can be created on the ruins that we're seeing increase around us all the time, every single day. Every single day we see. Today in the news, there was China, the vice foreign minister, is urging America to get its act together economically and financially because we have a duty and responsibility to the whole world. I mean, they are very worried that our president and our Congress is so irresponsible that we're going to throw the world into a complete economic shutdown. And so it's possible. It's entirely possible. Are we ready for it? Well, yes, by faith we're ready. I want to be able to see from the Lord Jesus where to go, how to act, how to survive that, how to build on that, how to recover from that, how to move forward with that, because it would be by the hand of God if it happens. And so my secret weapon in training my children, in loving my children, in pointing them into the future, is to give them Christ's commandments and to show them how to keep them so that they have this kind of relationship with the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. This is our hope. We are so enthusiastic. We're so optimistic about the future because we have Christ. We can see that this is no surprise to him that America would fall into apostasy, that the church would become so weak and cowardly. And we simply need to give our children the foundation to shore up their backbones so that they have not only moral confidence, but moral authority to lead. And so if you will do this, parents, your children will be in a very good place to face in the future the real world that awaits them. I want to thank you for your time and your attention, and may God bless you as you move into, together with us and with your children and with your grandchildren, you move into the 21st century. God bless you.